How do you do? Oh, allow me to introduce myself.
I am the last sane sports fan.
I am a genius by trade.
And welcome to The View from the Midwest.
I just knew too much. Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Possibly.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of The View from the Midwest. We'll start things off with a little bit of Blues talk. They lost by the score of 3-2 against the Vancouver Canucks tonight after having won 3 straight on home ice. They had moved all the way up to 4th place, but the way things keep jockeying around, that thing is going to change about a million times before St. Louis ends up playing again, because they played tonight on a Tuesday and now they're not playing again until Saturday against Edmonton. But the thing that I'm finally figuring out about this Blues team is I don't think it's a lack of talent. I think it's all up here. And that becomes kind of an issue because coaching can only push you in a mental side so far. They can put you in the right position, but you have to overcome whatever's going on in your head that's keeping them from playing a solid 60 minutes of hockey. And that's the biggest thing. They just can't seem to get it in their head to play that full 60 minutes. Tonight was a perfect example. They outplayed Vancouver in the first period. They outshot them by a lot, but Corey Schneider made some big saves, either that played into the way St. Louis played in the second period, which they came out and played an awful second period. I wouldn't put any of the goals necessarily on Jake Allen. There might have been certain circumstances where maybe a different positioning or whatever, he could have made a save, and he didn't. But having said that, none of the goals were his fault. But St. Louis came out, they played a horrible second period. They come out in the third period, they show some energy. They get a goal. They start playing up to their talent level. They get another goal. They start hustling. They take a silly penalty at the very end of the third period. You cannot end periods, especially if you're trailing, and take a penalty. It doesn't matter if it was a BS call or if it was a call that shouldn't have been made or if it was a call that you had to take a penalty. They need to stop putting themselves in those kind of situations. You're going to be trailing in games every once in a while, and you cannot put it in the referee's hands, especially to the point where by the time you kill off the penalty, if you do, there's only going to be 90 seconds or 60 seconds left in the game, which isn't enough time to really regain that momentum. So somehow the Blues need to overcome whatever's going on up here, because that seems to be the biggest problem, especially in the second period. I don't know what it is about this team. They're one of the younger teams in the league, but whether it's the long change or the fact that they're on the road and they can't seem to get the matchups that they want, second periods, except for a couple games here on the last recent homestand, just seem to murder the Blues. They don't seem to come out with that same kind of intensity that they do in the first and third periods. And I understand it's in the middle of the game, so I mean, maybe they're trying to conserve energy for the third, but there are just times when they will have a lead or the game will be tied and they will just blow it in the second period. I don't know what it is about that middle frame, but that is what Coach Hitchcock has got to get this team turned around with. They've got to come out and figure out that mental side of the second period. Having said that, though, I mean, every team is going to lose games. Chicago finally lost. They lost 2 in a row, actually, to Colorado and then Edmonton, which doesn't bode well for St. Louis, since the Oilers are hitting a bit of a hot streak, at least on the offensive side of the puck, and we have to play them on Saturday. But that's a whole nother topic. On the point, St. Louis really has to find a way to keep things rolling when they're on a hot streak. Despite the fact that they lost last night, if you play 2 solid periods, if they just don't blow it the way they did in the second, they still could have won. but they have to put together 60 minutes game in and game out. That is the biggest hurdle that this team seems to face, and that's all up here. Because as a young team, I refuse to believe that this team could actually be physically tired when plenty of other teams in the league who have more veterans on the team seem to be going well physically, and the Blues just have to find a way to turn it around. But Blues fans,
Don't stop believing.
we're finally starting to get players healthy. McDonald, Steen, and Tarasenko are all back. Now we're just waiting on TJ Oshie. Then the big question becomes, what do we do with that goaltending situation? Do they send Porter down? Do they waive D'Agostini? That was mentioned on the radio today, that they could possibly waive Matt D'Agostini and see if he would clear through waivers and keep the three goaltenders on the roster. I like Brian Elliott. I don't want to give up on him, but quite frankly, I almost think that that might be the Blues' best option right now. Keep Jarro Halak up on the bench. Play him every few games or so. Keep riding Jake Allen. As long as he's hot, if he cools off, then you see if Jarro can pick up the slack. And Brian Elliott, I think maybe you try to put him through waivers because the way he was playing the last time that he played, I just don't see anybody willing to pick him up at the salary that we're giving him. And then you put him down in the minors, maybe get him a little bit of confidence rolling back again, and then next year you let all three come into camp and see where things roll. It's that time of year, time for the big dance.
I can't wait till I get you on the floor, good looking.
No, not that kind of dance. It's time for the madness. March.
It is I who am mad.
Anyway, as we get right into it, we're going to run through some of the tournament brackets here. And we're going to start off things over in the Midwest, which is technically, a lot of analysts are saying that that's going to be one of the hardest brackets to get through. So we start things off with the number one seed Louisville against NCAA. Obviously, the Cardinals are going to move through on that one. Colorado State, the number 8 seed, faces number 9 Missouri. I've got Colorado State moving through, and I think that that's because not so much that I like the Rams, but I think Missouri has been inconsistent away from Columbia, and I think that's going to come back and bite them here in the first round. Missouri's talented enough to get to the second round, but even if they did, I think Louisville would advance past that one, the Sweet 16 at least. Moving down, we have Oklahoma State against Oregon. Oklahoma State's a fine team. They were deserving enough of a number 5 spot, but Oregon is a hot team. They were underseeded. They're a number 12 for some reason, even though they won the Pac-12 tournament. But coming into this, I think they're a little bit hot, so I think they're going to beat Oklahoma State. St. Louis, the number 4 seed, plays against New Mexico State, and although New Mexico State is going to present some trouble for the Billikens since they have one of the tallest teams in the nation, including a guy who's over 7 foot and over 300 pounds, I think the Billikens play a good enough defense that they are going to win that round and go on to face the Oregon Ducks. Wrapping up that top half of the bracket, I think St. Louis is going to beat Oregon, at least in my bracket, and then Louisville will go on to defeat the Billikens, because I think even though Louisville has been inconsistent, I believe they have more talent than the Billikens, and even though St. Louis plays a good defensive style of game, I don't think they have enough talent to defeat the Louisville Cardinals. Looking at the bottom half of the Midwest, we have Memphis against St. Mary's. I think Memphis is going to come out with the win there, and they will go on to face Michigan State, who I think is going to defeat Valparaiso, although the 3-14 matchup sometimes does produce some interesting games. I think Michigan State under Tom Izzo is always going to be hard to defeat in the tournament. The bracket below that is going to be Creighton against Cincinnati. Now that's a really interesting matchup, as it's a Big East team, Cincinnati. They've had a whole year of playing against some top-tier teams, and while they were in the middle of the pack of the Big East, they're going to be a tough out. But I think Creighton has enough talent and a potential player of the year candidate. So I think the Creighton Blue Jays are going to come out on top of that, and they're going to end up facing Duke, who I believe will, as the number 2 seed, they were going to easily dispatch with the University of Albany. So my final in the Midwest bracket is going to end up being Creighton. I'm picking as the upset over Duke. They will go on to face Michigan State. Michigan State will go on to defeat Louisville, and Michigan State will go on to the Final Four. Moving out west, the number 1 seed Gonzaga will play against Southern University, and I have the Zags moving on to the next round. Pittsburgh plays against Wichita State. Pittsburgh's going to be a tough game. This one was a hard one for me to pick. This one was kind of a toss-up in the 8-9 matchup. I went ahead and picked the Shockers. I'm going to be honest, I don't really have a reasoning for that other than the fact that I think Wichita State plays a good brand of basketball, and I think that they're going to come in and catch Pittsburgh napping a little bit, as Pittsburgh had a good run in the Big East tournament, but I think Wichita State's going to come out hungry, having lost in the finals of Arch Madness. The 5-12 matchup is going to be Wisconsin against Ole Miss, and although 12 almost always seems to beat a 5, I don't think it's going to happen right here. Wisconsin's been playing a tough brand of Big Ten basketball. They're going to be a big time out for any team that plays them. They've been inconsistent in the Big Ten, but they've also managed to pick up some big wins against the top teams in that league, so they're going to be really tough for Ole Miss to beat. And even though Ole Miss went on to win the SEC tournament, the SEC as a basketball conference this year was fairly weak. They weren't too bad, but I just don't see the Run Rebels pulling out the victory here, so I think Wisconsin moves on to the next round. Going to go on to face the number 4 seeded Kansas State Wildcats, who I picked to defeat the winner of the play-in game that will happen on Wednesday night. Also in that bracket, Arizona against Belmont. I'm picking Belmont in that one, not because I have any reason, just because I decided to pick an upset there, and why not? New Mexico, I picked to advance as the number 3 seed. They're going to beat Harvard. Harvard always plays an interesting brand of basketball. Those Ivy League schools manage to run teams to death, but I think New Mexico's going to handle it there and advance to play Belmont in the next round. The bottom half of the West Division, I picked Iowa State to defeat Notre Dame, and Ohio State will easily handle Iona. And then moving on in that bracket, Ohio State I picked to beat Iowa State, as the Cyclones' three-point shooting has to dry up at some point, and Ohio State plays that difficult, hard-nosed Big Ten basketball. New Mexico over Belmont, Gonzaga over K-State, Ohio State over Gonzaga in the 2-1 matchup, and Ohio State moves on to the Final Four. Moving out east, the number 1 seed, Indiana Hoosiers against the play-in game. And Indiana obviously is not going to be the first number 1 seed to lose to a 16 in that matchup. They advance on. The 8-9 matchup, NC State versus Temple. I picked Temple. I think NC State was overrated coming into this year. They were picked to win the ACC. The league was pretty weak this year, and they ended up finishing in 4th, I believe, behind Miami, Duke, and North Carolina. Now, they did make a little bit of a run in the ACC tournament, but it wasn't enough to get them a higher seed, and I think Temple is going to come out with an upset win there, not just by the seeds, but just by their overall style of play. UNLV against California in the 5-12 matchup. That is where I picked the 12 over the 5. California is not only playing decent ball right now, so is UNLV, but the interesting thing about that one is the 5-12 matchup. It should favor UNLV, but California is playing in San Jose, which is very close to their campus. So I think that one was a little bit of a mix-up there by the tournament seeding. So Cal actually will end up with a home court advantage, and I think they're going to use that to advance to the next round. Syracuse in the 4 will beat Montana at 13. Butler at 6 will defeat Bucknell at 11. That will be an interesting matchup, as those two teams have been Cinderella stories within the past 5 or 6 years. Marquette as a 3 will meet Davidson as the 14. I picked Davidson to win that one. Marquette, I believe that one, they're highly ranked because they had a decent year in the Big East, but I believe Davidson is actually going to pull off the upset there, and the 14 will move on to face Butler in the next round. Illinois, the 7 against Colorado, number 10. I picked Colorado to win that one just because Illinois is such a streaky team. They beat some Big Ten basketball powerhouses in Ohio State and Indiana earlier in the year, but they're so based on three-point shooting, and that is so streaky that I think Colorado comes in and takes the victory. Miami as a 2 seed is even going to handle Pacific at number 15 and move on to the next round. Moving through the rest of the East real quick, I have Indiana defeating Temple to move on to the next round. Syracuse over California. It'll be the Orange against Indiana. Butler will beat Davidson, and Miami will take care of Colorado, and it'll be a Butler-Miami matchup. Miami moves on through there. They will play Indiana, as I picked them over Syracuse. Indiana will pull off a squeaker over Miami as they play good defensive basketball, but I think Zeller would be the key factor in that matchup, and Indiana would move on to the Final Four. Now it's time for the South region, which is home to your Kansas Jayhawks. Yep, the Kansas Jayhawks have the number 1 seed. They will face off against Western Kentucky. And the interesting thing about this region is it does not scare me. None of the teams in it are anybody who I say, oh, they are going to definitely pose a significant threat to the Jayhawks' chances of advancing. And I almost think that that's what worries me the most. I almost feel that in a year where KU has been so up and down, they've had a year where the Jayhawks have, at their best, they look like they could run through the tournament. Nobody would even pose a chance of defeating them, and they would win a national title. At their worst, they look like they could be kicked out in the first round, and I think that's what does worry me, because Western Kentucky, while they didn't have a great season this year, they've made the tournament several years, and as a program, perhaps not the players on the team now, but as a program, I think that they have the belief that they could pull off the first 16-1 upset in NCAA history. But as long as the Jayhawks come in and play solid basketball, at least in that first round, I really don't think that that's going to happen, and I see the Jayhawks advancing to the next round. I picked chalk in the next one, the 8-9 matchup, UNC over Villanova, which would set up a Roy Williams versus Kansas matchup in Kansas City for the next round. And that would be a fan's delight as long as the Kansas Jayhawks would move on past that one. And I picked them to defeat UNC and move on to the Sweet 16. In the rest of the bracket, VCU over Akron in a 5-12 matchup. They will face Michigan, who I picked to defeat San Diego State. UCLA will lose to Minnesota, at least in my brackets, because the Gophers, although they've been extremely up and down this year, they rebound the ball extremely well, and UCLA shies away from rebounding about as much as you can do. So I picked the Golden Gophers to defeat the Bruins and send Ben Howland's team packing. Florida in the 3 spot will defeat Northwest State as a 14. San Diego State, the number 7, over number 10 Oklahoma. I just don't think that the Sooners have been playing solid basketball. They've managed to choke away a few leads late in the year, and I think the Aztecs will come out of that one. Georgetown, the number 2 seed, will defeat Florida Gulf with ease, and then the Hoyas will defeat San Diego State in the next round. They will meet Florida, who I picked over Minnesota in that 3-11 matchup. Michigan over VCU. They will play the Kansas Jayhawks in the Sweet 16. I picked Kansas to defeat Michigan. Michigan's got some great scores. They have a heck of a lot of talent. And my friend Jason Wang isn't going to like that matchup, especially if Kansas wins, because, quite frankly, we all know that deep down he's a Michigan fan, even though he's a KU graduate. But I picked the Jayhawks to play that shutdown defense and take care of the Michigan scorers and hit just enough buckets on the offensive end to move on to the Elite Eight, where they will play the Georgetown Hoyas, who I picked over Florida. A lot of prognosticators have the Hoyas coming out of this bracket, so I did pick them to defeat Florida, but I think Kansas will handle that Big East basketball style, and Kansas will move on to the Final Four. Now, in the Final Four, it would be Kansas facing off against Indiana, and a Big Ten matchup, at least in my bracket, with Michigan State against Ohio State. And I think Tom Izzo, he's just a fantastic coach. I don't necessarily like the guy. I don't necessarily like Big Ten-style basketball. I find it a little bit boring. But Tom Izzo manages to get into the tournament and turn a team who might be only talented enough to win 24, 25 games and have 6 or 7 losses, and that's not necessarily the case with this year's Michigan State team. But if he can do that with those kind of teams, I can see this Michigan State team going to the finals, and that is what I picked in this bracket. If Kansas had to play against Indiana, that one worries me because I believe everybody would cancel each other out. You have Jeff Withey, who is a talented defensive style center, and he would face off against more of an offensive guy in Zeller, who is capable of altering shots and getting inside the lane and playing defense as well. And you have Oladipo and you have Ben McLemore. Those two might cancel each other out. I think it would come down to the fact that Kansas plays defense like a Big Ten team, but they have an offense that's capable of scoring a lot more points than your typical Big Ten matchup. So I think the Kansas Jayhawks would pull off a slim victory over the Indiana Hoosiers and go on to the finals. And if you know that I put Kansas in the final, then you know who I got to pick. I mean, the Jayhawks are going to get the upset over the Michigan State Spartans. In a revenge matchup, as those two teams faced off against each other, Kansas had the lead into the second half of that one, and they managed to let it slip away as it was a really inexperienced team. They weren't used to playing with each other. Even though this team has 4 seniors starting, none of them had seen significant time except for Jeff Withey last year in a starting role. And Kansas, I believe, will get the upset against Michigan State in the finals. Now, you know I was going to pick that one if Kansas made it all the way to the finals. And basically, all you have to do if you want to do well in your bracket is pick the exact opposite of whatever I told you, because I've never won a bracket challenge in my history of doing them. So take that for what it's worth, and hopefully that was at least entertaining, and you got to know at least what's going on my brackets.
I remember when I lost my mind. There was something so pleasant about that place. Even your emotions have an echo in so much space. And when you're out there without care,